A cold settled over the ancient pines. No birds sang, the branches sighed with a wet rustle like silk across stone. Where a stranger of no country raised a banner of living night, the hush deepened until it had the thickness of a thing. Kingdoms built on sunlight would learn, piece by bitter piece, how hunger made subtle and cunning could be willed into a mind, and that mind could bind shadow into an army. One northern ranger, crouched upon a ruined watch, would learn how close that hunger could reach to the heart of men. The watch was older than the lord who claimed the valley below. Its stones gave off the smell of moss and old salt, and the crenellations wore the scars of storms like a weathered brow. From that height, the ranger could see the dark sweep of the long road, the scattered lights of homesteads, and the spill of pine that broke against the horizon. He had been out there most nights for many winters, listening for the stealth of wolves and the clatter of riderless hooves. That evening, the air itself seemed to listen back. He was called Edron, though he bore no lord's ring and had no lowborn keeper. He named himself for the road named him its steward. Edron watched the moon when it climbed, white as a thin coin. He smoked the dead ash of a cold fire and kept his knife close. It was a pale gleam, no more, until a shape moved along the ridge like a star fallen on hooves. The rider was pale as marrow, as if light had been taken and made into a face. His cloak drank the moon. Where it brushed the air, the brightness slid from it and pooled into cloth, vanishing as a candle flame might vanish under a bell. The horse under him seemed a thing of shadow also, but not the harmless dusk of evening. It was the wrong shadow, denser, quieter, as if it had learned to hold its breath. The man sat straight, with a countenance that had the patience of old hunger. Edron gave him a name he had learned in ragged songs of the north. He called him the Dark Count, and when the cloak swelled and fell like a breathing thing, he called the riders that followed the shadow hosts. They passed below the watch in a line that drank sound. Men in the valley who had been tending fires and mending nets froze as if some far bell had struck. A boy on a doorstep blinked and made a stepping motion, then stood still with the empty look of one who remembers the form, but not the meaning. Where the shadow hosts walked, the shadows of other men lay still upon the ground like discarded things. They were outlines without tether, inert as a child's forgotten toy. One watchman, a blunt-shouldered fellow named Jor, woke and walked uselessly to the gate, his arms moving in the business of waking while his eyes followed nothing. Edron saw the hollowness in the man's face and felt his own shadow pull inward like a cord wrapped tight. It was not death, nor was it a spell of sleep. It was as if the night itself had been cut away and folded into a banner. Edron's hands went to his belt. From the ruins, he had watched many strange signs in seasons of war, but this was new to the craft of men. His mouth tasted of iron and pine sap. He had to bring proof, some piece of that living night that would not be denied. He climbed down stone and root, avoiding the way the moonlight pooled and died where the Count's cloak had passed. The underwood smelled of wet iron and an old cold, as though frost had come and receded in a single breath. At the road, he saw a scrap snagged upon a hedge, a swath of cloth darker than a shadow, like black water. It hung not fluttering, but still, sucking light into its weave. Edron did what rangers do. He did not hesitate. His knife cut through the thing, and the fabric clung to his palm as if alive. It left his skin as one might leave a coin to cool upon the tongue. He wrapped it in a piece of oilcloth and ran. The road was a press of hints and hushed noises. Owls, where they had been, were mute. The rack of the trees seemed to close in, branches pointing like fingers. Once, in a small clearing, he thought he heard a murmur, as if men were speaking without voices. He tightened his cloak about his shoulders and smelled only the cloth in his hand, cold, metallic, and the taste of old graves. Night insects did not chirp. The moths fluttered around his lamp as if bewildered. Every living thing made room for this new darkness. The border keep he approached crouched on a low hill and kept its own secrets close. Torches stood at intervals along the parapet, making a ring of orange teeth. Its banners, small and browned by sun, snapped listless in a wind that would not touch the road. Edrin rode up to the gate on a borrowed horse, breath steaming. Men with halberds watched him, faces pale, as if they too had learned to be wary of the dark. He spoke his name when he was taken in and showed the cut of his blade, the rag of night wrapped in oilcloth. They led him straight to the great hall. The Lord sat at a table lit by a single bowl of oil. He was not young. His hands had long known the weight of ledger and spear in equal measure. His beard was kept, salt and copper, and his crown was a simple circlet that had come from the smith at the valley's edge. Edrin had seen him before, striding the courts to hear the pleas of tenants. When the ranger entered, he found the Lord's eyes not on him, but upon the road outside, as if listening. The hall was too quiet. The serving girls left to stand with their heads bowed. There were no songs. A hearth crackled tiredly. "Lord Ernan," Edrin said, and set the wrapped cloth upon the table. One of the captains unrolled the oilcloth with hands that trembled. The light fled from its edges as if it had been stolen. The Lord reached out and touched the thing like a man would touch frost, and then drew back as if he had burned himself. He looked at Edrin, and for a moment the Lord had the face of a son about to be told bad news. "You name this a banner of the Dark Count?" the Lord asked. His voice was even. There was a hunger in it that made Edrin prick his ears, the hunger of a man who had lost much and longed to stop losing more. "I name him no lord of ours," Edrin said. "He is no ally. He binds the shadows of men, Lord, and leaves their bodies to walk without their souls. Where he passes, the men wake hollow, and their shadows lie dead at their feet." I cut this from his cloak by the roadside. Edron's words were a knife sharpened to a place of truth. He did not tell the Lord of the small, quiet things, the way the wind had shied, the way the birds had fallen silent. He did not need to. The sight of the thing on the table told the rest. Lord Ernan's jaw worked. He had been tending the border for many seasons, and raids had ground him like winter under a millstone. Crops had failed. Men had gone to pay wolves with their sons' mouths. At times, late in the night, he had thought he would throw himself into the hands of any power that promised bread and safety. The Dark Count had not come empty-handed. His riders had taken watchfires and horses and left no answer. Rumors carried other words, that the Count offered yield against hunger, warm nights when the frost would lift, a protection that asked only a measure in the shadow of a sign. "Protection at what price?" Edrin asked. He kept his voice low because the hall had the appetite for whispers now. "A bargain with such a thing will hollow the folk. The best men will look like men and be empty. The harvest may come, but whose hands will bind it? Whose feet will plow. Ernan's fingers closed around the rim of his cup. He had a face that was not unkind, but where Edrin saw resolve, other men might have seen calculation. The Lord's eyes fell again to the rag. The torchlight seemed to drip away where it neared. One of the captains barked a question to a servant in a thin voice, and the sound was swallowed at once by a hush that was not natural. "He sent a rider to my steward," Ernan said at last. "He came with words civil as any treaty. He promised that men would be spared the wolves. He showed what would be given in exchange and what would be taken. He spoke of order, of a peace held in shadow, so no foreign blade need come." The Lord did not say he had already thought the bargain over 1,000 times. He did not tell Edrin he had roused at dawn with the temptation as one roused from fever. Edrin's fingers tightened on the pommel of his old knife. "He bargains with the dark," he said. "His price is more than coin." He met the Lord's gaze. "If you take what he offers, you will have a land with quiet gates and dead shadows. You will have men who cannot love or hold. You will have harvests gathered by empty hands. You will not know in the end whether you have a realm or only the husk of a realm." There was hunger and there was weariness in Ernan's face. He looked older than his years by the toll of making impossible choices. Around them, the hall's men shifted like stones falling in some slow earthquake. The captain, who had unrolled the cloth, whispered, "He could end the raids, my lord. He could bring war on us from without," Ernan answered, eyes not leaving the strip of night. He knew the words he might one day use to justify himself. He knew also the small, monstrous reason his hand trembled toward them, the faces of his starving people, the graves of sons, the ache of impotent treaties. In the hearthlight, his fingers left wet marks on the table. Outside, a herald's horn breathed a single long note from the hill. It was not the war horn that calls to arms, it was a different tone, older and more patient. It meant a messenger had come. Edrin felt the blood in his ears as if the horn had struck within him. He leaned forward. "Do not answer," he said. "Send no envoy. Gather your men, secure the folk." Ernan rose then, slow as if from an old wound. He did not lift his hand for sword. He instead reached for his seals, for parchment, for the slow machinery of parley. The captain shifted. The Lord's voice was not unkind when he spoke. "Or we may die fending every wood and barn until none are left. Or we may speak to him and learn what he demands." He paused, and the hall inhaled with him. Edrin saw what the night had taught the count, that thirst can be turned to longing, and that a lord with no hope will lay down his sword for a promise. He saw the shape of the choice as plainly as a blade. The cloth on the table sucked the torchlight until the bowl guttered. Ernan's hand hovered above the seal. He had not yet broken it. The decision teetered between two sharp things: defiance that would bring war, or bargaining that might keep the folk alive and unmade. The horn sounded again from a distance, and beyond the gate a horse's hoof made a soft, certain noise upon the road. Ernan's fingers closed on the quill. The captains looked to the door. Edrin's heart set itself like a stone upon the scale. He could not move them by force. He had no levy. He had only the rag in his hand and the truth he could bear. The Lord bent, dipping his quill to the vellum, and Edrin heard the breath of men in the hall hitch at the motion. The hand that would write was the hand that might begin a parley with a shadow. The moment hung, full of peril and promise, and the road outside kept its mute and patient watch. He came at the second bell, a shape small and bent with travel. carrying a cloak dark with rain and a basket of things that did not belong to the hills. The sergeant at the watch took him inside the lean tower, lit a single coal, and watched the man's hands tremble as he laid out a scrap of cloth and a coin blackened like old iron. He would not meet their eyes. His breath came shallow, as though he kept something within him by force of will. "Where have you been?" the sergeant asked. His voice was simple and blunt, as the talk of men who have seen wolves and want no riddles. "Beyond the ridge," the stranger said, "toward the hollow, where the birch is thin. There are lights that walk." He swallowed. The coal popped once, as if it had a pulse. They take the color from a man. They do not slay him and leave him dead. They take something softer, what you see when the sun passes over a pond. They bind that thing to themselves. The sergeant's hand went to the hilt at his hip, a comfort more than a weapon. "Names," he said. "Whisper the names you heard." "Count," the stranger answered. "He sits in a fortress my feet dare not name. He draws shade from the living. He binds it like netting. The things that walk from him are no persons. They are the cold outline of a man's shadow, given a will and sent forward. That word, shade bound like netting, fell into the room and filled it with an old fear." The sergeant felt the coals glow as though it had shrunk. He called the captain by a sound as minimal as rust on a spear. By dawn they had sent runners. Before noon, the captain stood with a map and a mood that had been shaped by loss and habit. Scouts returned in groups no larger than a thought. Their clothing was raw, their faces flecked with ash that would not wash out. They did not speak of chests taken or houses burned. They spoke of people who were not gone, but gone at the same time. They walked out into the night, one scout said, the words stumbling. They looked like smoke that needed a top to lift it. A man's shadow rose from him and went. He stood and watched it go. He could not follow. We cut at the shade. It was like slicing air. The blade met no yielding flesh. We thrust our torches to it, and the flame slithered away as if it met a mirror. An old lore master, one who had been more used to reading taxes than tales, sat long in the corner and drew from a pouch a narrow glass rod that hummed when the sun struck it. He listened without surprise, though his hands trembled. His name need not be spoken. He had a habit of speaking where men had quieted. There was an old word for this, he murmured, veil binding. It is not making corpses mind, nor is it mere sorcery of the hearth. It is slight upon the portion of us that is neither bones nor breath. It takes the shadow and gives it law. The living is left with a husk, and the lawless shadow becomes an arm of its binder. They tried to picture it. The sergeant remembered a child who had once watched moths at a lantern so intent that the child forgot to blink. The child could not hold the moth. The moth was only the idea of a thing. This, the men understood, was like that. The shadow left and walked with intent. It opened gates. It moved across moors like a low mist and entered places that a sword could not reach. Reports grew more specific and dread more fixed. The first outlying farm that had replied to the watch's flag was found with the gate latched and the hearth cold. No bodies lay in the yards. Pots stood on the ground as if the hands that had held them had simply been taken away. The ward stones that marked the farm's boundary, a ring of carved rocks installed years before to fend off petty spirits, glowed faintly under evening, then flickered and were still. A boy who had seen the ward's light go dim said it was like a heartbeat stopping mid-beat, not with a bang, but of forgetting. Then a frontier hold that keep with a single watchtower and 300 souls fell without a cry. Its riders were seen fleeing down the lane like stags, then they were not. The gate was open in the morning. Inside the great bell hung still, its rope frayed but not broken. The great hall was neat. Cloaks were folded upon benches. A man lay sleeping by the hearth, eyes open but blank as river stone. His shadow had been gone for some days, neighbors said. They had thought him spared. The farriery shed bore no sign of fire, but the beams were cool and dry. Yet a scent like old perfume lingered, and the smith reported at once that metal had begun to behave strangely in his forge. Steel took no keen from the anvil. Blows did not temper edge. Heat ran off like a thought onto another path. At the council, which met under a roof that had kept its beams through more winters than most, the men and women spoke little of hope. The captain set a strip of map between two hands and pushed it like a small dark river toward the center. "We have met them," he said, "and our swords did no more than slice at smoke. Fire will not touch them as fire touches cloth. The wardstones do not bind them as they should. If we cannot cut them and cannot burn them, then all that remains is to change the field of battle itself." "Aye," said the lore master, "but what field? Where are the laws they obey? If his power is shadow, then perhaps the law is light. If the veil is the binding, the answer must be its opposite." They agreed on a dangerous experiment. Dangerous because it would mean turning the Count's own trick against him. The dangerousness lay not only in the deed, but in the moral riddle. To pull at the binding might in some small and terrible way, loosen all bindings, and leave more undone than before. Still, the frontier burned people without shadows could not be left. The plan took shape like a slow frost. A volunteer, he was not a leader. Volunteers of no rank often show more courage, stood and said, "I will." He had a young face, freckled with a watchman's steadiness. He would walk the line while the instruments were set. The instrument was no sword. It was a crafted mirror made of hammered metal backed against glass and fitted with a shard of a pale crystal the lore master had found in an old estate. The mirror was to be turned into a lamp by those who could make light burn like a blade. Ropes and lenses were made. They spoke quietly of sunskins, of lensing, of glass set in silver. The volunteer bound a talisman to his wrist where a small cord could be cut if need be. They assembled at dusk on the high road where the valley thinned. The light they sought would not be the light of torches. Torches only fed what the Count had already learned to ignore. They had tried a trick of reflecting the sun in many small facets and hoped that many small points of truth might prick whatever fell between. The mirror was set upon a frame between two carts. The lore master placed the crystal in the center, and under his voice he chanted, not with words that men often use, but with the soft intonation taught to him by books, a cadence made to steady thought, to weave focus into an object. The volunteer walked out before them. He carried no sword. He carried nothing but the cord at his wrist and a lightness in his step that was not bravado, but a kind of hope. The sun had gone. A thin cream of dusk lay on the world. The mirror shone in the cold light like an unblinking eye. The plan was to catch the last of the day and hold it, to distill the dusk into a thread of true light. They would on that thread bind a line to the Count's shadows and pull. They waited. The wind was patient. Then, from the hollow across the ridge, they saw the first of the shadow hosts moving like a low fog, a stream of darker breath across birch and rock. It reached the road where the volunteer stood, and for a moment, time seemed to do what the watchman had once seen in a child's moth chase. Stop. The volunteer's breath stuttered, his collarbone showed under his skin with each intake. The lore master lifted the mirror. The crystal caught the last slant of sun and flamed with a white that seemed both hot and cold. They had expected a burning. They had not expected the sound that came, a low cathedral note, not ugly but vast, like a bell struck not by a hammer but by a sky. The mirror spilled light that did not scatter but converged, a spear of brightness that cleaved not outward but inward. Where it fell, the air brightened and then went thin, like the inside of a peeled apple. For a heartbeat, the shadow host that lapped the volunteer recoiled. The volunteer laughed out loud, a sound like a thrown stone skimming twice and sinking. The watchers leaned in and tasted hope as if they could hold it by the forehead. Then the mirror buckled. The crystal shivered and did something the lore master had not foreseen. Instead of dispersing the binding, it opened a seam into it. The light found the place where shade clings to flesh and pride. But it did not free it, doubled. From the seam leapt not brightness, but a second darkness, darker than any night they had known, and with a sheen like frozen glass. It slid along the light beam, fed on the mirror's heat, as a moth feeds on oil, and took the shape of a figure. It was like the volunteer and not like him, like a man walking out of a pool of midnight. It bore the same cloth as the volunteer, the same turn of jaw, but its eyes were hollows, filled with a blue coldness. It moved without sound, and when it raised a hand, the ropes that held the mirror snapped as if they had been cut by wind. The mirror fell. The crystal scattered on the ground into glittering dust, tiny knives that gave off no light. The volunteer fell as well, not dead, but as if his inner life had been unthreaded and the spool had been taken and set elsewhere. He stood panting, hand reaching to his wrist as if to catch something that was not there. "My shadow," he whispered, and the voice was two voices in the same throat, one plain and terrified, and another low, speaking in a voice that had no warmth. "My shadow walks not with me." The shadow thing turned and looked toward the ridge, toward the hollow the Count kept. Where its gaze met the watchers, each man's breath caught. It raised a hand, and the stars seemed to tilt. Far away, across the valley where the frontier hold sat like a word forgotten, the wardstones pulsed once, then again, and something shifted under the earth like a sleeper turning. No wound had been struck. No blade had sung. Instead, in that instant of broken light, they had made a new kind of weapon, but not one wrought in the way they had intended. The mirror had not undone the bond it had given the Count another form of binding, sharp, obedient, and cold. The volunteer still lived, but he was a man with a rent in him, someone whose shadow had learned to be whole away from him. The council's plan lay strewn about the road like so much glass. Men moved to gather the shards, to bind the volunteer with ropes and with tenderness, while others stared toward the ridge and felt, without naming it, that whatever had emerged would not be content to remain the size of a single valley. The lore master lifted what remained of the crystal between finger and thumb and found it warm. His lips formed a word that had no answer presently, and he said only, "We have made a bell that rings to him." So they sat about the failed lamp, and the man who now walked with a missing part and listened to the valley breathe, waiting to hear whether the Count would answer the strike or would, in silence, turn his shadow armies to do a work that had not yet been imagined, They had meant to force a seam and draw the stitch apart. Instead, they had given the Count a new needle. The night gathered, patient as a trap, and the watchers began to plan what peril they would now risk to take it back. The argument had not yet cooled when the sound slipped like a breath through the great hall. Voices rose and fell, iron-edged, pleading. The rasp of old bargains made anew, and over them all the small, steady hum of the relic went on as if it listened and counted. The disk lay upon a cloth of simple white, unadorned and betrayed by its own insistence. A warmth that did not belong in that stone, a thin, living light that set the shadow beneath it like ink on a page. Men leaned forward. A dwarf clasped the pommel of his axe. An elf folded a hand over the hilt of a long knife, the tips of his fingers white where he held his breath. No one truly watched the door. He moved as a thing of habit and of necessity, not a prince nor a captain, but one schooled in care and in quick hands, an emissary who had come to speak of roots and treaties, of salt and stone, who had listened and learned and counted wrong the number of eyes upon him, cloak to cloak, glove to glove. He took the relic when the talk turned to blame and the blades turned to bargains. The disk did not scream. It lay cool against his palm, and then, as he drew from the hall's light into the corridors dim, it sang, not with words, but with an answering warmth that trembled at the pulse beneath his wrist. He felt it, and he understood the temptation that had brought him there, a thing that could be used to hasten an end, would be told into use by those who feared the night. He met the minor lord in a courtyard where the moon was thin and the barracks smoked like low embers. The lord's face was not carved like a king's face. It was knotted with worry. He kept his house by watch, and by oath his name meant little outside the valley, but within its walls he held sway, and people answered to him because he answered too, and because the Count's raids had already taken half his stores. The emissary flung the cloth at his feet and set the disk upon the paving as if laying down a sword. The lord's hand hovered, eager and trembling. This was not the council of the high table. This was a private bargain made under rafters and a leaking sky. "Why, will it burn him?" the lord asked. His voice was that of a man who had stood at a child's bed and watched fever bloom. He wanted certainty. He wanted a measure of daylight to hold against that black army which crept at the edge of maps and grows like rumor. The emissary said nothing. His fingers still smelled of the hall's wax and spice. He had stolen the relic to test it, to see if a daylight could be bent as men bend plows. The Lord believed a device could be commanded like any arrow. The elf's warning echoed in the emissary's head, quiet as moss. The relic answers only to sacrifice. They made no sacrifice of coin. Gold had been offered in the great hall and had been found wanting. They made no sacrifice of fame. The Lord had no heir to sell and would not barter his land. He balked at first, and then he did what small men must do when the world presses its thumb to the throat of their people. He offered his own blood. He cut his palm, not theatrically, but with a blade that seldom left his belt, and let the red bead gather and fall upon the cool face of the disk. The emissary watched the drop spread, darkening the stone for a breath, and then the stone drank as if it had hunger. The change was not lightning nor thunder. It began as a small opening of sound, a note like a throat clearing, and then a warmth that carried the smell of summer fields and iron. The soldiers of the Lord, 80 stood huddled in their sleep sheds and barracks, dull with the cold of many nights. The first who felt it woke with a start, as if from a fever dream. He rose, and in the torchlight, his skin seemed to take on a glaze of pale metal. The light upon his palms was not the sun's, but a pulse that beat like a lamp within bone, like a flare that had learned to stand where the heart should be. One by one, they opened their eyes. The air ate itself around their breath. You could hear the sound of cloth on wood as they stood, and the whisper was more terrible than the howl of wolves. No one in the courtyard had thought beyond the bargain. The Lord had wanted time, hours, perhaps days, to close the valley gates and to ferry the women and old men into caves. He wanted a line of men who could push back a night horde at the gate until reinforcements came. He had not wanted a miracle that would refuse to be recalled. What rose from the garrison was not merely armor made bright. They moved with the silence of statues, each footfall a soft forbearance, and the light they carried was not a light to warm, but a light that sought. The soldiers did not look like living men. Now they were instruments tempered to a single purpose. The emissary's face grew ashen. The elf's words came finally loud, because at last they were true. Sacrifice answers only to sacrifice. The transformed men could stand in the shadow and make it shrink. A hand lifted, and the black at the edge of the yard thinned, as if a cloth were being pulled away. They were deadly in that way the old tales had feared, not because they slew with a blade, but because in them the day had become a device. Where their light touched, shadow thinned and unraveled. The Count's scouts, sent to learn, to test, to steal, found themselves at the edge of a ring that burned and did not sear skin. They recoiled. Where a shadow's hand would have taken a throat, it flinched and fell apart into cold, dry dust. The Lord's soldiers stood fast their faces. Where one could see them were still the faces of men who would answer to orders. But there was a hollowness now where the small daylight of private thought had been. The first cost showed itself in subtler ways. The men who bore the light moved like men who had given something away, and that something was more intimate than sleep. The glow inside them was not a boon so much as a debt, and the debt demanded repayment in time and in silence. One veteran lowered his head and touched his mouth as if to call a name. His hand came away trembling, and he did not speak. A young recruit reached for his wife's token beneath his shirt and found the silken thread warm to the touch, as if the light had passed through to it. He wept then softly, and none of the light-bearers bent to comfort him. The Lord watched rage fought with fear in his face. He had bought an hour and had given away a portion of his men's names. Word ran up the ridge like a bird that carried both warning and wonder. From the campfires beyond the valley, men and elves and dwarves peered toward the courtyard and saw a ring of pale that kept the dark at bay. They saw also the shape of something offended, for the shadows do not fade without answer. When shadow is burned, it learns a new cunning. In the farther reaches of the Count's host, the black coalesced into sentries that no longer pretended to be wind and fog. They became bodies of moved absence, and they bent like a hunting net toward the light. "We are using our own as a torch," the elf said aloud when he arrived, stepping out from beneath the eaves where he had waited with counsel cold as mist. His voice cut, a blade in speech. "Light is a theft when taken from a living place. You have set within them a sun. It will not return, friend, and it will not be merciful." The Lord bristled. "Better to burn than be eaten," he countered. His hand tightened on the relic's pouch, though the disc was no longer in his keeping. If they hold until dawn, if they hold until those lines meet, then perhaps we will have traded ours for the lives of many. A trade of hours for a kind of death, the elf said softly. He looked upon the soldiers as a shepherd might look upon ewes turned to stone. They will stand. They will drive back what moves in darkness. They will do so without complaint. And they will begin to forget the footing of their old lives. A light in lieu of a soul burns down names. It welds men into implements. Silence gathered. Even the night seemed to lean. The transformed men heard none of this. They held the courtyard circle, their faces turned toward the low, jagged line where the Count's scouts scurried like beetles. A boy from the garrison, no more than 17, stepped forward and touched one of the light-bearers on the shoulder. The soldier did not turn. The boy's fingers came away with a faint shimmer clinging to them, and he held it up as if to show his mother a moth. "It's warm," he said, and his voice was an odd thing, small and afraid. The emissary, whose hands had stolen fate from that great hall, fell to his knees and covered his face. He had thought of use and effect. He had not thought of the hollowing. The Lord turned upon him, fury cracking his voice like a whip. "You tricked me. I did what you sent me to do," the emissary replied without raising his head. "You bade me take counsel and bring you tools. I brought you a tool. I did not know it would ask for this price. It asked for nothing," the Lord spat. "I gave it a price. Words cannot close a wound where a name has been taken." The elf's face was very old and very grave. A light that answers to blood will answer to blood again. It will ask for measure every time you feed it. You cannot store day. You cannot command it without being commanded in turn. It will make of your men something not wholly your men. Beyond the courtyard, the shadow sprites that had fed for nights upon barns and on the quiet of fields pressed closer. They did not rush, for the daylight had taught them caution. They probed at the edge of the ring and found that the pale made them brittle. Yet where a shadow met the light in that place, a strange exchange occurred. The light melted part, and the shadow gave up a shape. From these shapes came the soft noises of small children crying and the old men coughing. These were not the dead, but the echo of human acts the Count had stolen and folded into his host. The light burned, and with what it burned it cleaned some things and unearthed others. The Lord's jaw worked as he watched his men. He had bought what he believed he could pay for. He did not yet know the currency of what he had spent. His hands trembled, but he straightened his shoulders and called a muster. "Form to the gate," he commanded. The men responded with the crispness of soldiers taught to answer. They moved as if to obey a drum. The emissary rose and took the cloth from the paving, folding it with clumsy fingers. The elf did not stop him. No punishment would stitch back the names now. On the ridge, the leaders watched, some with greed, some with horror. A king's gaze lengthened like a spear pointing at the valley. A dwarf grunted and struck his iron with a palm, for iron is an answer to most troubles. Among the watchers, a plan began to shape, one that would use the light, or at least try to. Orders would be given, troops would be set, and the valley would become an instrument of war with the Lord's men as strings. The emissary's theft had broken the table of council and set a new table in motion, a table of desperate decisions. In the courtyard, the light-bearers marched to their posts, and with each step the circle of protection contracted and yet stretched, as if it rewired the very way night and day met there. The Count's shadow forms drew nearer, patient, learning. No one could say yet if the thing wrought in the soldiers would be salvation or scourge. The Lord set his jaw and pointed toward the gate. "Hold that way," he said. His voice was small. "Hold until the reinforcements come." They would hold. That was the immediate answer. They would stand and they would shine. They would take and be taken by an exchange they had not chosen. In the watching hills, commanders bent and whispered as men prepare to make use of a light that asks for blood. Below, the courtyard breathed with the soft, labored sound of men who carry day inside them. And beyond the valley, the Count's shadow army paused, like a lung held in the act of drawing, learning the shape of the thing before it. The next hour would tell whether the bargain would be a bridge or a trap. The next hour would find how many names would be spent to keep a gate from falling. They waited at the watch through a night that seemed to thicken like oil. The watchfire guttered in wind that smelled of iron and wet stone, and over the ridge the Count's clouds churned with a dull, unnatural motion. No stars came above the cloud bank. A sickly light pulsed like a heart that would not die. Men shifted upon frozen elbows and listened for footsteps that did not speak of dawn. And the only living sound that broke the waiting was the call of a distant wolf and the sharp, low whisper of breath upon chainmail. The stranger came at the turning of the third watch, not with trumpet or parade, but at a slow, quiet gait of shod feet. He wore a cloak darker than the night between the mountains, and when he moved, the torchlight slid from him like water. The captain at the palisade half raised a hand and then let it fall. Caution and curiosity warred across his face. Nobody spoke his name. Names travel like flame, the captain said, once the silence had bowed its head. They had little to waste on a stranger. He did not ask for shelter. He came and stood beneath the paling of the watchfire where the others could see him, and his voice was like hollow stone, old and careful. "I bring a thing that will burn the long shadow," he said. The men looked at one another. Hope is a hungry thing and quick to leap at any spark. The ranger beside the fire, thin, dark, with eyes that had been kept awake by too many miles, lifted his chin. He had not asked for signs or portents. He had only come because there was a road and a duty on it. Now he listened as though the new words were part of that duty. The stranger spoke of wards of light, not of flame nor of torch, but of an older kind of illumination. He traced with a finger in the ash the shape of a ring and a tether, and the ash glowed faintly where his finger passed. Such light, he said, is not made of glass or coal. It is made of ballast. It must be named, and it must be given weight. Give it name alone, and the wind will steal the name. Give it blood alone, and the fire will take the blood. A bargain is struck. The light will hold, but something of the giver will remain within it, a thing marked and changed. The men pressed closer. The ranger's hand went to the hilt at his hip without thinking, then relaxed. He had been taught to read the cost of battle as certainly as he read a map. To go into the field against such foes as the Count commanded required cunning and cruelty, or it required a different sort of courage, to let go. The stranger looked at the ranger with eyes that did not quite meet his. A tether, he said, maybe a scrap of life, a finger, a lock of hair, breath taken into a cup, or it may be a name, spoken and bound. Either will hold the ward, either will mark the holder. There was a rustle at the palisade, a child's laugh that came out wrong and then was cut. In the guard shadow, a small figure peered through the gaps. The elder sorrel of a child, no more than a sweetling by the ranger's reckoning, with cheeks gone pale from too much fear. He had been taken from a nearby hamlet the night the shadow host rode through, found stowed beneath a wagon, and brought along because none had courage to leave him while roads were watched. The ranger had taken him in at first because the child's eyes followed him like a compass. Now the boy crouched where the firelight would not reach him, trembling with a fear that belonged not to a child, but to a witness. An ally broke from the watch ranks then, a figure known to the ranger by more than look. He had sworn an oath in another season, words spoken beneath a tree that now seemed a lifetime away. He had vowed never to bring children into war, had sworn that those hands would not be stained. He had spoken that oath with the iron of young honor, and he had kept it with stubbornness beyond reason. But as the stranger described the tether and named its price, the ally's jaw tightened. The child looked toward him, hope and terror braided into a single small face. "Is there another way?" the ally asked, voice rough with something like pleading. He had fought before and had watched men go hollow with victory. He had seen victory eat its people from the inside out, leaving only triumph and bones. "Tell us any other path," he said. "Tell me I may keep that oath." The stranger's face did not change. "There is always payment, and there are always choices," he said. "But the Count's shadow will not be cast out by spear or by arrow. It will be unmade only by light that keeps and remembers. To bind such light, you must tether it to a life not spared by the bargain, or to a name that will be bound within the brightness. The anchor will be taken inside the ward. The anchor will remain." The ranger stood. He had been quiet until then, the sort of man given to action rather than argument. The flame painted his cheek with a moving map of shadow. "Give me the tether," he said. "Give me the weight. I will bind it." The ally started as if the words had hit him like a stone. "You will what?" His oath made his voice brittle now. He had sworn to keep children from the field. He was sworn not to send others' kin into the fire. The ranger looked at the child, at the small hands that would never know the road the ranger had walked, and then at the ally. There was something in his face that had been carved by long-standing fatigue and resignation, yes, but also a strange lightness, an acceptance of ends. "If you ask me to sit and watch as the shadow grows," the ranger said, "I will not. I have no right to ask others to pay what I will not. Let my name tether the light. Let my shade become a beacon, and let the Count's night find no purchase." He lifted his hand and pointed to his chest. "My name. Take it." The stranger's smile was a thing without mirth. "Names are precious ballast," he said, "but they can be stolen if willingly given. The giving will change you. When the name is bound, part of what it calls will move into the light. Memory thins. The sound you gave to it will grow quieter in your own ear. You will be the same and not. The world will keep you, but you will keep a shadow of your own making." The ranger bowed his head. He could have offered a finger, a lock of hair, his own blood. Those would have been physical and clean. To give a name was to give home. To give a name was to hand over an anchor not easily found again. He thought of the faces of those he loved, of the map of his life traced by footsteps and hushed songs, and he weighed them like coins. The dark above the ridge flared as if in answer, and from within it came the low susurration of 1,000 wings. The ally moved then. For a heartbeat, it seemed he would speak the old oath and hold the line. Yet his hand trembled and reached instead for the child. He had sworn he would not send the young among swords. He had sworn he would not be the cause of another's loss. Now he took the child into his arms and folded him as if to protect him from the winter of those clouds. "If you bind with your name," he said to the ranger, voice strange with new resolve, "then I will break my vow. I will not let him watch the warding and fear us as makers of sacrifice. He will sleep. He will be removed from this place. It was a small betrayal and a large one. Oaths are cords that bind more tightly than leather, and to break them is to loosen a part of oneself in a way that cannot be mended without cost." Around them, the men breathed and waited. Some drew their cloaks closer, some looked away. The ranger did not flinch. He stepped forward and unhooked a small locket he had never worn in the field, but had kept always near his heart. Within it was a scrap of cloth and a name carved on a thin sliver of wood, the name of a hill farmer who had once given him shelter, the name of a sister who had died under starless skies. Names stacked like straw within him, and the locket had held them like seeds. He placed it upon the ash where the stranger had traced his ring. "Speak it," the stranger commanded softly. The ritual, it seemed, needed not only the giving, but the speaking. The sound had to be cast. The ranger breathed, and his voice came small and steady into the chilled air. The name that fell from his lips was a name of soft vowels and hard edges. It trembled like a reed in winter. When it left him, the air seemed to take it and hold, and for a moment the watchfire blazed with a light unlike any other, not white nor gold, but a clear, luminous thing that set bruises to glow and made the ash look like ivory. The tether took. The light shaped itself into a ring above the locket, and threads of brightness braided outward, forming wards that hummed like bees in winter. Yet, as the light climbed the palisade, it drew from the ranger the salt of his memory, a thing no one could see, but that all could feel. He blinked, and there was a hitch. The subtle silence where a beloved song should have been. He could not picture the face of the woman who once gave him bread. He remembered the weight of her hand, but not its laugh. A part of him folded inward like a page torn from a book. The watcher at the gate, an old man who had once been proud of his oaths, hid a look of sorrow. He had known what this act might demand, and he had not wanted the price. Yet, as the light shivered and settled into shape, the Count's clouds above the ridge thinned ever so slightly. The pulsing heart in the sky eased its pace as though a hand had rested upon it. The men felt the change in their bones. It was as if a pressure lifted from the chest of the world. They did not cheer. There was no singing. Light had been called, and the world had answered with a cost. The ally had wrapped the child in his cloak and sprung for the hidden path that led away from the watch, feet silent as a thought of fleeing. With each step he took, he felt the thing he had sworn to hold loosen. He had broken his word, and the sound of it would not be mended with apologies. He moved for the boy because he feared the other cost, the loss of innocence through watching terror. He chose instead to carry the child into the dark, where perhaps he could keep a small world intact. The ranger watched him go and heard the name inside himself recede like a tide. He felt lighter in the ruin of it, not wholly whole, as if a knot within him had been cut and some small bird released. He touched the place where the locket had rested, uncertain whether the hole he felt was empty or filled with something new. And then he turned his face to the wards, to the ring of light that stood between the watch and the Count's tide. "Will it hold?" someone asked. The question floated thinly over the ash. The stranger looked at the ring and then at the ranger. "For this night," he answered, "and for the march of days to come, it will hold. But all wards need tending. They heed name and life, and the more you pour into them, the more they draw. This is not a wall one builds and leaves it, is a thing that will ask and must be answered. You have bound light to a life, and that life will be altered. You have borne a price. Now you will have to bear the watching of the payment." The watch fell into a patient, fragile quiet. Outside, the Count's sky brooded and tested the edges of the new glow. The wards did not shine like a sun, they shone like a promise made with a cost stamped upon it. The ranger felt the world tilt by degrees, not into despair, but into a different ordering. He listened for the names he had known, and some came faint as the echo of bell tolls. Others had gone like smoke. He knew now what he would be asked to become, a keeper of light that contained within it a part of himself, a man who could not entirely remember the song that once named him. As the allies' steps faded into the wood, and as the stranger folded his dark cloak about his shoulders and melted back into the night that had birthed him, a murmur went through the men at the watch. It was not a cry of triumph. It felt more like the turning of a page whose next line was not yet known. The wards had been raised. An oath had been broken to shelter a child. A man had given his name away and would wake with a story that was missing its middle. The Count's forces would come in the morning, and the new light would stand between them and the host. The ranger stepped forward and laid his palm upon the cool ring of the ward. It thrummed against him like a living thing, and as he stood there under that strange, borrowed illumination, he heard the distant cadence of hoof and wing. Victory had begun its tally, and it would ask for more. He breathed and felt the hollow where memory had been. Then he turned toward the east and walked, stepping into the thin hour before dawn, knowing that to hold the light would mean to lose what he had held most dear. The choice carried him onward, and there was no turning back. When the last of the Count's mist broke like a net, it was not with the triumphant peal of horns, but with a sound like ice underfoot. The air went thin and bright. Where there had been a vast moving dark, there lay instead a scatter of pale things, cloaks shredded to rags, banners split like dried leaves, and the hollowed husks of creatures that were no more than shadows congealed into brittle form. Men and elves stood amid the wreckage, blades wet with a rain that was not quite blood, and the forged beacons on the watchtowers hissed as though relieved to breathe. The stranger remained at the highest parapet, his cloak sodden with dew, and his hands stained in ways that mattered less than the look upon his face, a kind of mourning that neither sword nor beacon could lift. Rangers moved among the fallen with the slow, careful motions of those who have learned to spare the dying. They spoke little. The binding had been done at great risk and in great silence. The rangers had wrapped their own shadows with iron and prayer, and then tightened the rings until the dark consented or was forced. For a moment, the Count's phantom army had been given a shape enough for steel to find purchase. That slender margin made the victory possible. Steel bit and thinned the mist. The Count himself had unmade like a story retold too many times. His voice tore, unthreaded in the light, and where he had stood there was only a cold, bright absence that slid away into the gullies. Yet even as swords were sheathed and the assembled breathed, There was a long, slow intake of cold among the watchers, as though someone had opened a door and the house remembered winds. They had won the night back, and the stars returned as if uncleared debts had been paid. But the price within some hearts had been paid in a different coin. The first to notice were the binders, the men and women who had fastened their shadows and given a fraction of themselves that the magic might hold. At first, the change was subtle, a hesitance in a laugh, a pause longer than memory would sustain when a name was called. A father lifting his child in greeting found the child's face hazy at the edges as though seen through a pane of heated glass. An old hunter, who had once remembered the exact place a boar had been struck 20 years ago, could not recall the season of the wound. These were small erasures at first. They sat like pebbles beneath the skin, unnoticed until hands brushed them and they stung. In the days that followed, the towers rang with steps and the murmur of counsel, but there was less talk of triumph than there was of what the victory cost. A healer who had bound her own shadow to steady a faltering torch confessed at dawn that she had forgotten the color of the sky in her childhood. An apprentice smith who had watched his comrades make the iron rings could not call to mind the face of his mother. They spoke of dreams that had grown thin, names that slid from the mind as if they were letters on a page and a sudden rain had blurred the ink. To others, the change was plain to see. Eyes that no longer settled upon the familiar with the ease of habit, mouths that sought some taste of feeling and found only an outline. No one had spoken of the aspect of soul that had been traded. That was an admission too close to sacrilege, too close to the old tales that warned of bargains. Yet those who had bound their shadows bore a mark none could see but themselves, a small, precise absence where a knot of memory or the warmth of a morning belonged. They felt sometimes as if a corner of their names had been cut away. When they looked in a pool, their reflections returned a face they knew, but the eyes showed a different interior. Songs they had loved now arched and fell without finding the familiar place where joy used to rest. In the quiet, they would touch the place at their ribs that had once been full and say nothing, because the shape of what had been given could not be measured. Light, it turned out, had a cost. The beacons that had flared against the Count's host had been wrought with old oathcraft and newer cunning, tempered with the iron of watchmen and the telling weight of sacrifice. They needed the tethered darkness to pull the enemy out of its wraithways. That was the lesson the stranger had taught, and he taught it without false cheer. He walked among the binders with his hands folded, listening to their questions and giving no easy answer. Once, when a young woman who had lost the memory of her father's voice asked him why he had brought them to this, he only said, "There are choices that save a world and leave its people smaller. That is the shape of war." The words were thin comfort. They did not recover what was gone. Among the free peoples, there were those who would not accept such a tally without fight. Elves and men, Dunedain and hill folk, took to the roads to fetch lore and lore-wise folk. Old books were opened, soft-voiced elders spoke of rites that might call back what was loosened. Yet magic that takes back is seldom exact. One scroll promised the return of memory in exchange for a promise to be kept in sorrow. Another told of a river that, if a man dipped his hand, would make him remember, but only the memory of the river's edge and not of the house from which he came. Bargains multiplied like ripples across a still lake. The stranger watched the council and did not interfere, though eyes that had learned to read storms thought they saw a tremor of regret cross his face. People found ways to live with the small absences. They made lists and charms, and they taught new songs whose words slid around the holes in their recollection. Children grew up with guardians who would prove each name and story twice over. Marriages were rewritten with care villages, kept more maps of their own lives. The watchtowers held their stations, and the beacons were mended and gilded through long nights, so that future darkness would know the price before it came. There was a stern, proud business in these labors. The free peoples were not good at surrender, even to their own losses. They repaired walls, and they made new oaths. Yet even as they raised what was broken, each repair bore a seam. There were other stranger effects. Shadows, once tethered and then loosed, did not simply resume their old habits. They remembered being armed. In lanes and under eaves, darkness shivered in an alert that was not its old, lazy habit. A simple alley that had once been safe at night could feel watched, and a forest that had known only the slow breathing of leaves now held pockets of cold that listened. Animals avoided those places for a while. In houses where a shadow had been fastened to a ring and then removed, the hearth flame sputtered as if the very warmth were reluctant to return. This memory of being called to arms caused another kind of sorrow. People reported moments when a shadow slipped from the heel of a boot and lingered at a window, as if choosing whether to resume the old place. Parents felt a chill when a child's shadow hesitated before lying down. Some found comfort in lighting extra candles. Others walked with a touchstone in hand, something that reminded the night to be merely night. The stranger taught a small number of watchers how to sing the dark to sleep, an odd low chant gathered from old mountain ways. It did not undo the calling, but it taught the dark to remember a different song. Among the binders there grew a fellowship of those who had given and therefore knew the wound by a shorthand of shared silence. They met in small rooms and under leaning trees and held one another's hands in ways that plain folk might find unnecessary. There they traded memories in the softest possible manner. A hunter would tell of a spring he could recall, and a smith would tell of a tune, and the others would try to fit these fragments into the missing places. Sometimes, by slow art and patient repetition, a name glued back into a life. Sometimes not. Each success was a small miracle. Each failure brought a new, quieter kind of mourning. Yet life in the lands healed in ways that did not depend wholly on the return of what was stolen. People learned new songs for old fields. Children, quick and unscarred, made games that did not require the old memories to exist. Lovers found new intimacies that were not shaped by the vanished things. The free peoples, who had once been threatened with an unending night, kept the night and made of it a cautious friend. They set lanterns in lanes. They taught children to call out in the dark, and they carved the names of those lost in stone and in song and in the leaning of hands at hearth. These rites eased the rawness, but did not remove it. The cost hung like a bell in the chest of the land, and every year at the turning, when the beacons were rekindled, people would touch that bell and remember the thinness of what they had given. The stranger, after many nights, left the high parapet and walked among the broken things where the count had been cleft. He stooped and picked up an iron shard and let it cool in his palm. The watchers watched him without expectation. At last he spoke to them, and his voice was neither boast nor plea. "We kept a world," he said. "We kept what walks by the light, but we cannot mend every hole for you." His gaze rested on the faces of those who had handed away pieces of themselves. "You will have to learn the new shape of your names." There was no false comfort in his words. They were stern, like the touch of a smith removing a burr. The listeners bowed their heads, and some of them smiled with a kind of courage that did not need rhetoric. And yet there remained one work undone. The Count had been unmade, yes, but the echoes of his calling would not be satisfied with silence. Some nights a thin wind carried a scent like old velvet and cold iron. In certain hollows the cold held longer, as if waiting for an answer. The watchtowers, now regarrisoned, sent riders into the hills to find and teach the slack places to sleep. Scholars of old craft read late and argued with the stubborn patience of those who cannot leave half a question. A small company of binders, those who had paid and lived, resolved to travel beyond the borders to places where shadows had gathered since the battle. They would go not with barb and brand, but with lanterns and songs, and the careful human work of remembering people into being again. The stranger watched them set forth, and as they rode out, his face was like a cave at dusk, open to the world, but shadowed. He had brought a salvage and a wound in equal measure, and he did not pretend the balance was fair. The riders passed beneath the beacons that still smoldered, and the land exhaled in a sound like the settling of long bones. It was not peace, not in the old sense. It was the beginning of something more stubborn and intimate. They were going to the places where darkness had been trained as an instrument, and they were going to unmake that schooling not by force, but by patience. The final scene held no triumph, only intent. A lantern bobbed through a copse, and within it a face pale with sleeplessness and determination looked out. Beside him walked a young woman who had once given the memory of her mother and who had learned to sing the dark to sleep. Her hand found a small iron ring at her belt, and she slid it into her palm as if testing an old hurt. They did not yet know whether the work would restore what was lost or whether it would simply teach night to remember different rhythms. But they were moving into the hollows, and movement is itself an answer. The stranger lingered, then turned and began to climb the tower stairs. Above, the beacons smelled of smoke and iron. Below, the land listened, and somewhere, the darkness. That had been called to arms felt, for perhaps the first time since the forging, the gentle insistence of being asked to let go.